What's that? Oh, yeah. I stand up here and everybody gets quiet. Because what I'm going to say is that interesting, right? Yeah, right. Okay, Chris, I've got the clicker, but I know you're producing back there, so I'll just let you, we'll kind of go with the flow. I'll let you change them because I know you're maybe switching back and forth with people that are watching. So kind of a different environment. Last week was kind of an adjustment for me because, it's a different environment in the auditorium and the classroom. We're also streaming for people back home. I couldn't see the screen back and behind me, so I'm always turning around like this, and I'm turning away from the mic, and people can't hear. And so hopefully we're adjusting. I'll get a better plan here as we go through the class. So if you weren't here last week, we're starting a study on Deuteronomy. If you don't know where that is, it's in the Old Testament. It's about the 4th or 5th book from the beginning. And last week, just as a quick review, if you weren't here, last week, Old Testament theology. I looked at a few commentaries and read a few things that people have written about Deuteronomy, and a lot of people will compare it to Romans. So when you think about Romans and the part that Romans plays in the New Testament, and I know Chris has talked about this before as well, that Romans is important in terms of understanding. It's a very theological book in the New Testament. It gives us a lot of good information about our relationship with God under the New Covenant. And Deuteronomy is that way in the Old Covenant. It's good, and it's a key, we talked about a colossus, or it's a good outline for the Old Testament theology. Also, we talked about how Jesus quoted or referred to Deuteronomy more than any other Old Testament book except for maybe Psalms. So when we think about Jesus' teaching, and whether you look at his temptation in the wilderness, or you look at other times that he was asked questions or referred to the Old Testament, he quoted from almost every book, I think, but just a few of the Old Testament. And Deuteronomy was one that he quoted from or referred to more or as much as any other book. So certainly Jesus looked at Deuteronomy as an important source of wisdom and teaching for God's people. Another one was that Paul, just like Jesus, Paul draws on Deuteronomy as a source for wisdom. Hopefully we'll look at some more of this later on in this class, how much Paul actually draws from Deuteronomy as he teaches godly principles, right? It shouldn't be a surprise to us. We serve the same God who has the same desire for his people under a covenant relationship as he did in the Old Testament. So we can draw on that in order to understand maybe how we can please God and how he looks at our relationship with him under the new covenant. We talked about how Deuteronomy is a backbone of prophetic literature, and we'll get into more of that as the class goes on, but we look at how the prophets, both through inspiration and also probably because of knowledge of Scripture, will draw back to Deuteronomy and what God said would happen and how he was going to deal with Israel when they did certain things. So it's important from that standpoint. The better we understand Deuteronomy, the more we understand why the prophets say what they do and why they say what they do. We talked about another reason was Deuteronomy provides an outline or expectation for interpreting and evaluating Israel's history. So there's a lot of background information in Deuteronomy that's good for us to understand. We learned that it's placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight in the context of the structure. We talked about how it was the only book read aloud every 7 years, and we looked at the verses that showed that. So tonight, I mentioned last week, I want to talk a little bit about the structure. How do we look at the structure of Deuteronomy and kind of put it in a form that helps us understand the various parts of the book? That's really what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I don't know if you're like me or not, but in school, my least favorite subject, now this is before I became a Christian, my least favorite subject was history. I did everything I possibly could to avoid history. So when I looked at the general eds, if I could take a history or a physical education. If I could take history or music was my class, I kind of did everything to avoid history. I don't know why. I just didn't find history something easy to study and to do well in school. And I was more of a math, science guy, accounting, those kinds of things, numbers. I liked those kinds of things, computers. But when it came to history, man, I just struggled. So I did a lot to avoid that. Now, I have to admit that after becoming a Christian, my interest in history really peaked, or was greatly enhanced, because I had the pleasure of going to Jerusalem at one point and seeing the old city, and I think about ancient history and what we read about happening in the Bible. And as you learn more about the Bible and the things that happened throughout the history of God's people and in the context they happened in, when you talk to people about that history, they're really fascinated that you understand that much about history. But that's kind of where it stopped. I don't know if you ever heard about, I don't know, Chris is, okay. I don't know if you've ever heard these terms, but have you ever heard the term suzerain or vassal? Now, maybe some of you academic types might have. Suzerain or vassal. So some time ago, probably because we had this upheaval of archaeological discoveries, a lot of discoveries in the ancient world of tablets and various forms of artifacts that help us understand a little bit more about what was going on in ancient history. There was a comparison made between a suzerain vassal treaty or covenant and the book of Deuteronomy. Conceptualize in our minds and try to help us compartmentalize the book of Deuteronomy and how it's structured. So a suzerain was a sovereign or a state having control over another state. This is the formal definition. We'll talk a little bit more about it. The vassal was a holder of land by feudal tenure on conditions of homage and allegiance. So basically a holder of land at the pleasure of a sovereign or a ruling authority. So the suzerain would document, so in this this treaty or covenant, the suzerain vassal treaty or covenant, the suzerain would document previous events in which they did a favor that benefited the vassal. Maybe they spared them their life as they came in and conquered their land. Maybe they fought side by side with them so that they weren't conquered and oppressed by another people or whatever, but they did something that benefited the vassal in a significant way. And the purpose of this would show that the more powerful group was merciful in giving, therefore the vassal should obey the stipulations that are presented in the treaty. So it's this idea of making a treaty with someone because of what something a sovereign or a ruler had done for them. So we're going to talk about the elements of ancient treaties, and then we're going to kind of compare this to the structure of Deuteronomy. So here's some elements that we see in Near Eastern ancient treaties, and I'm going to show you an example of one tonight as we continue on here. First, there's a historical prologue designed to evoke loyalty. So it's kind of like, remember what happened? Remember when you did this and I helped you? Or remember when you were about ready to be conquered and I came in and I saved you and I drove your enemy out? There's going to be some kind of historical prologue that's designed specifically to remind the vassal of what the suzerain has done to deserve this loyalty that they're asking for in this treaty. And then the second thing is that there's stipulations of the treaty. So here's what you will do, here's what I will do, or here's what you won't do, and if you don't, then here's what I will do. So there was stipulations was another aspect of these treaties. It might start to sound familiar at this point. The third was there's blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. So, maybe if they swore an oath or they paid whatever they were supposed to pay to the sovereign, then, the sovereign would take care of them and they would protect them from their enemies. But if they stopped, then maybe they would drive them out of the land, or maybe they wouldn't go to protect them if somebody came in to try to conquer them or another thing like that. The fourth thing is a list of divine witnesses who will hold the vassal accountable to the stipulations in the treaty. So some of this may start to sound familiar at this point. And finally, there's a provision for recital of the treaty and a deposit of the tablet. So they wanted a reminder, right, of this agreement and the stipulations or the terms of this agreement. What is it that I've done for you? What is it that you've agreed to? And just kind of a reminder and a constant witness, essentially, to this treaty arrangement between the two parties. So I have an example here. Is a treaty from about 1300 to 1500 years before BC, before Christ. It's a treaty between Mursili II of the Hittites and Tupi-Teshep of Amuri. Have you ever heard of those guys? So yeah, you're getting a history lesson tonight. Now, there's not going to be a quiz next week, but so don't worry about that. But this is something I want to use as an example, and this is just one of the treaties that's been discovered in this area. I'm going to show you a map, actually, if you can see this. So right here, you're going to see, you might look familiar. If you look at the very bottom center of the map, you're going to see Tyre, Sidon. You're going to see Syrian desert. So you see this is it's in this area, very close to the area of Israel and Palestine. And this is an example of a treaty that they found that goes back to about 1320 BC. It's between the king of the land of Hatti, which is up there in the center, and then Teshep. And I don't have it on my screen, so I'll tell you what it is in a minute. It's from Amuru, which is down south there. So it's a treaty between the king of Hatti and the king of Amuru. So here's an example. So here's the historical prologue. And we won't read all of this because I don't want to take all our time doing this, but I just want to point out some of the similarities. So in the historical prologue, we see, thus says my majesty, Mursili, great king, king of Hatti, hero, beloved of the storm god, son of that person, great king, king of Hatti, hero. So establishing the suzerain, right? And then it goes back into a little history. It talks about how Tupi-Teshep's grandfather became the subject of a previous king of Hatti, and how that happened, and that when there was war, he protected only my father. My father protected Azuru together with his land. He did not seek harm in any way. It talks about how when his father died, according to the request of your father, I did not cast you off because your father had spoken your name before me during his lifetime. I therefore took care of you. But you were sick and ailing, and although you were an invalid, I nonetheless installed you in place of your father. I made your brothers in the land of Amur swear an oath to you. So you see this, it's kind of just a reminder again, right? It's just the king of Hatti is just reminding Aruzu, or Tupi-Teshep, who's a grandson to Aruzu, about the history of their people and the agreement between the two areas. And then we have an example of a stipulation. So observe the oath and authority of the king. I, my majesty, will protect you, Tupi-Teshep. And when you take a wife and produce a son, he shall later be king in the land of Amuru. And as you protect my majesty, I will likewise protect your son. So we see this commitment or agreement to protect. The tribute which was imposed upon your grandfather and upon your father shall be imposed on you. So there was a tribute that he expected to continue to be paid. If, while the king of Egypt is hostile to my majesty, you secretly send your messenger to him, or you become hostile to the king of Hatti and cast off the authority, becoming a subject, you, Tupi-Teshep, will transgress the oath. So again, the idea of obedience to or disobedience to this treaty or this covenant relationship. And then farther there at the bottom, if some matter oppresses you, Tupi-Teshep, or someone revolts against you and you write to the king of Hatti, then the king of Hatti will send infantry and charity to your aid. So again, just this outline of the benefits and the blessings and the curses, essentially, the stipulations that are part of this treaty. Then the last few things here, I think we got two of them up on the screen behind me. Provision for deposit or recital. You see this in this particular treaty. A duplicate of this tablet is deposited before the sun goddess of Arena, since the sun goddess of Arena governs kingship and queenship. And in the land of Mitanni, a duplicate is deposited before the storm god. It shall be read repeatedly forever and ever before the king of the land of Mitanni and before the Hurrians. So you're going to start to see some similarities here when we start to go into Deuteronomy. Next is a list of witnesses. The 1,000 gods shall now stand for this oath. They shall observe and listen. The sun god of heaven, the sun goddess of Arena, the storm god of Hatti. He's basically calling out these deities to be witnesses to this arrangement. And then finally, the blessing and curses. All the words of the treaty and oath which are written on this tablet, if Tepi-Teshep does not observe these words of the treaty and of the oath, then these oath God shall destroy Tepi-Teshep, together with his person, his wife, his sons. But if he observes the words of the treaty which are written, then these oaths shall protect him, together with his person, wife, sons, grandsons, etc. So, as we look at that and kind of the context or the structure of that treaty, and I think what I saw if you Google structure of Deuteronomy, you might find this as well, but I think it was back in the mid-1900s, is the first time that somebody did a fairly involved comparison of the ancient and Near Eastern treaties to the structure of Deuteronomy and recognized a lot of similarities in the structure. And I think that's reasonable, right? We're talking about a people and a culture and a time when Moses was writing this, they would identify with that idea, right? Their sovereign, God Almighty, and their relationship with him. So in Deuteronomy, we can see a similar structure. So we have a historical prologue. That's what we're going to see in chapters 1 through 4. Again, just a recounting. Remember we talked last week about how you go through Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, you get to Deuteronomy, and now you kind of repeat everything you read. You're getting a repetition of all the things that God did as Israel came into the wilderness and out of the wilderness and to the promised land. So this historical prologue, a reciting of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel since they left Sinai, and designed, again, it's important, designed to instill trust and motivate loyalty. So then, I don't know what my computer's acting up. Okay, so here's an example out of Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 and 36. There we read, has anything been done like this great thing, or has anything been heard like it? Has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard it and survived? Or has a God tried to go to take for himself a nation from within another nation by trials, by signs and wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord, he is God. There is no other besides him. Out of the heavens he let you hear his voice to discipline you, and on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words from the midst of the fire. So again, that's just an example of the things that we'll read in that first part of Deuteronomy, which is under this structure, this first part of a historical prologue. So the second is the stipulations of the treaty. And this is what we see primarily in the bulk of Deuteronomy. This is basically chapters 25 through 27. About 22 chapters of the book really outline the stipulations of the treaty. We might say covenant, right? We know that essentially God entered a covenant relationship with Israel. And so the structure is very similar. So the bulk of the book concerns what is expected of Israel when we look at the stipulations. And here's an example from Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 1. Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I am speaking today in your hearing, that you may learn them and observe them carefully. And we see a lot of that as we go into those stipulations in Deuteronomy. This idea of, hear, O Israel, that's the Shema. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the beginning of chapter 6 as well. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Yeah, there is one God. And so this idea again of being careful to observe the stipulations of the covenant relationship. Then the third thing obviously is the blessings and curses, and we see that primarily in chapter 28 which is a long chapter detailing what will happen if they keep or if they violate the stipulations of the covenant. So when we get to that, we'll notice that in that one whole chapter, basically, chapter 28. Then we get to the witnesses. So the witnesses are also a good comparison between the two. We see the same thing in Deuteronomy. Normally, the suzerain will invoke the names of gods, as we saw in the example, the Mercilli treaty. The suzerain will invoke the names of gods because they are a higher authority than themselves. But who's a higher authority than Yahweh? There is no higher authority, right? So we know Yahweh would not invoke anything higher than his. So since there is no higher authority, he summons creation itself, right? Heaven and earth as his witnesses. And we'll look at an example of this. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 25 through 26. It says, "When you become the father of children and children's children and have remained long in the land and act corruptly and make an idol in the form of anything and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed." So again, sounds very familiar, doesn't it? That idea of invoking heaven and earth as witnesses against the people who violate his covenant relationship. Here's another one from Deuteronomy chapter 30. "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse." And it goes on in chapter 19 there. So, on several occasions when the prophets, later on, as we go later on in the Old Testament and later on in time, on several occasions when the prophets indict Israel and Judah, and that happens a lot, doesn't it? Because there's, another generation, right, comes up that does not obedient to God. And so we see in several occasions Israel and Judah are indicted for their sins, and the prophet will summon heaven and earth to witness how Israel has violated the oath. That's going back again to Deuteronomy. And the idea that God said and Moses both said that heaven and earth would be witnesses against Israel if they violated the terms of his covenant relationship. So we're going to look at some examples. Here's Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 2. "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me." So again, calling back to the heaven and earth as witnesses to the rebellion of Israel. Micah chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. "Hear what the Lord says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel." Jeremiah chapter 2, 11 through 13, we have another example. "Has a nation changed its gods, even though there are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." So we see again, this is a common idea that when the prophets are calling out the disobedience of Israel, that they will call on heaven and earth as witnesses to that disobedience. Chris, I was going to, I know it's hard when we think about people having comments or asking questions. We talked about maybe having someone that would run a mic around. I don't know if we want to try that or not, but so people can hear, or I can try to repeat. The problem is my ears aren't very good either. I've been going on now for about a half hour, so does somebody have any thoughts or it's something that I've said that has spurred the gears, got the gears turning, and you think of something that you want to share? Don't worry.
I do, and I can cheat because I'm back here.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things you see through the nation of Israel, the history of the nation of Israel, especially when they start to get into the idea of a king, is you see God repeatedly tell them, right, I'm your king. I'm the one that's in charge. You don't need a king. All throughout the history of Israel, God is trying to arrange their nation in a similar way to the other nations, but with him instead of all of these earthly authorities. Mm-hmm. This treaty, if a random person came to Israel, a proselyte or a pilgrim or sojourner, and they looked through the sort of the founding documents of Israel, they would recognize this and be like, oh, this is like what we do, except instead of a king, another king, it's God.
Right.
And I think that really plays into when he gets mad at them for asking for a king. I'm the one who did all this stuff. You're the guy that's helped you through all this. Why are you going to do what everybody else does?
Yeah.
So setting up how other nations did things, but better because it was God and not people, right?
Right. Excellent point. And that's actually going to be one of the points we're going to talk about, that why this comparison kind of works. And I think exactly what Chris said is one of the reasons. Any other thoughts, questions, Dick? Right. Yeah. Right. 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 And here are the consequences. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I'll repeat for people back home that he's saying that, thinking back as long as Deuteronomy 1500 BC to 1300 BC, how early on people recognized a need for there to be a structure. There need to be rules defining how people were going to treat each other, how they were going to work together or live together, and the consequences of not following those rules and what would happen. And it's no different than our laws today, as you said. It's the same today. We have laws governing our social structure, which help us all understand how we live together. Right. Just families, yeah. Yeah. The whole nation came out. They had to be, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, he's saying that, when you think about before Egypt, when it was just Abraham and his family, God was dealing with the patriarch, and he was, but once Jacob and his family went into Egypt, they came out over 2 million strong. There had to be a different structure, right? And that's one of the main reasons that God puts, his covenant relationship and all those ordinances into place. Larry?
That structure really existed at least as far back as Abraham, because when
Oh, yeah.
God told Abraham to get the birds and these other things, and he knew exactly what to do with them and how to arrange them, and that was their form of covenant making at the time of Abraham.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think as soon as you had children, right, as soon as people had children, they understood there had to be some rules, right? They had to lay down the law, right? There had to be something to, yeah. And I also want to go back real quick to something Chris said, which I think is important, is that before Israel even asked for a king, in Deuteronomy we see God says, when you ask for a king, here's what will be a good king and a bad king. We're going to talk about that in this study. And that's how good kings and bad kings are evaluated, is in the context of Deuteronomy. Don. Yeah. And a lot of times they're dry. Yeah. Don's pointing out in the verse that we just finished reading, the contrast between living waters and hewed out cisterns. The idea that God is an eternal source of spiritual life, and how they abandon that and hewed out for themselves cisterns which are really of no value. They just collect, dead water that runs off and a lot of times go dry. So, great points. So as we continue on this idea of witnesses, again, heaven and earth are summoned separately instead of creation in Deuteronomy. I think this is reasonable because of the need for two witnesses. We see this fairly well outlined in Scripture. When we look at, for instance, Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 6, which says, "On the evidence of two witnesses or of three witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of one witness." So again, we see consistency. When you think about, when you're parenting, when you think about things that you tell your children about how they need to behave, and the way they need to do things, and then if they see you doing them the same way, they see there's some consistency there. I think we see that with God, don't we? I mean, God doesn't want us to hold to one standard and hold himself to another standard. I think if he asks us to make sure we're going to have two witnesses, he says, well, how can I make this same point? I think that's interesting, at least. And so we look at this idea, and this is a concern that we also see in the New Testament, this idea of having two or three witnesses in order to condemn a guilty person. It's an important principle we see in the New Testament. So we look at Matthew chapter 26, verses 59 through 61. "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. And then at last two came forward and said, 'This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" So again, the idea of two witnesses in order to condemn. Matthew 18, 15, and 16. You might be familiar with this passage when we think about church discipline. "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of two or three witnesses." So if you take one along with you, how many witnesses are there? Two. Yeah, at least two. So on the evidence of two or three witnesses. And who is saying that? Yeah, Jesus. So again, consistency in terms of God's desire for there to be justice. 2 Corinthians 13:1, "This is the third time I am coming to you. Every charge must be established by the evidence of two or three witnesses." Paul writing to the church in Corinth. And then 1 Timothy 5:19, Paul instructing Timothy, "Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of two or three witnesses." So, finally, the last thing, we talked about there's 5 elements to this treaty, right? And we've gotten down through witnesses. And the last thing is 5, this provision for recital of the treaty and deposit of the tablets. And we see this in Deuteronomy as well. First in chapter 31, verses 10, 13, when Moses commanded them, saying, "At the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of remission of debts, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place which he will choose, you shall read this law in front of all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, the men and the women and children and the alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn and fear the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law. Their children who have not known will hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, as long as you live on the land which you're about to cross the Jordan to possess." So again, just a provision for this recital of the law to make sure that everybody continually heard the terms of this, the stipulations or the terms of this covenant relationship. Then the next one is Deuteronomy chapter 31, 24 through 26. And this deals with, like I told you before, like in the ancient Near Eastern treaties, like in that treaty that we looked at as an example, that would be on tablets that would be put in the temple of their god or whatever, that would be there present in front of everybody as they came, kind of as a witness. And we see this in Deuteronomy chapter 31 between God and Israel, verses 24 through 26. It came about when Moses finished writing the words of this law in a book until they were complete, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, "Take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may remain there as a witness against you." So I think, again, a valid comparison to the structure of this treaty that we looked at. Okay, so I'm flying right along here. We're going to be here about another 45 minutes, so hopefully you all ate dinner. So implications. Why does it matter? Why is it maybe good to consider this comparison? When we look at the structure of Deuteronomy and how it compares. I think the first one is that Yahweh is presented as suzerain, right? He is the sovereign. He's the Almighty. He's the one who deserves praise. He's the one that deserves obedience and loyalty. He's in charge. His claim on Israel is not on the basis of natural order or even divine election, but on the base of his salvific work in bringing them out of Egypt. That's a big word. I had to practice. Salvific. You know, on Google, if you put a word in there, there's a little speaker. You can let the computer say it for you. I don't know if it's right or not, but everything you hear or read on the internet is true, right? So it must be right. Salvific. In other words, because of him saving his people from Egypt, right? He brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. He talks about that continually. Because I brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand, right? He delivered them from the captivity in Egypt. And I like, again, that comparison for us. And we'll draw more application as we go through this study. But for us, this idea that we have been delivered. God has delivered us by something even more wonderful, right? By the sacrifice of his own son. So the second thing, why does it matter? Because it's a narrative history which is designed to evoke loyalty. So, it's a reminder. We talk about taking the Lord's Supper every week, right? To remember his sacrifice, to proclaim his death until he comes again. So that idea of remembering and it creating a response within us, a heart that desires that relationship and to hold on to that relationship. The third thing, stipulations are a response to Israel's salvation, not a means to salvation, right? So again, the idea that the stipulations, what we do, we can't be saved by doing the things that God has said we need to do, right? It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats I feel like Joe Biden. No, I'm sorry, I didn't say that. That was bad, I know. I get nervous, I admit it. I don't have a teleprompter up here. Well, I kind of do actually have a teleprompter. But I don't have that part on here. Anyway, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to remove sin, right? We need Jesus' sacrifice. So again, we can't obey enough to save ourselves. That salvation comes as a gift, something that God did for us. The fourth thing, no other ancient culture conceived of its relationship with its deity in terms of a covenant. That goes to Chris's point, and that's what I meant when I said we're going to get to exactly what he said. So I think that's an interesting thought that he had. If somebody were coming into the land of Israel that was, unfamiliar with the people and came in and they would see, okay, this is a familiar structure, but I've never seen this. I've seen it with kings, but I've never seen it between people and their God. That was a very unique thing. No other ancient culture conceived of its relationship in that way. So, any other thoughts or questions about structure in that way? I'm glad to see most of you are still awake. That's good. That's a good sign. Yeah, Larry.
I was thinking about what Larry number 1 said a while ago about Abraham, and that he followed God's instructions, and is that it was counted for righteousness after this in 15. So faith was
And all the more impact for us, isn't it, that we have God's Word. All of us have it. We don't have to go to where the ark is and pick up the book and read it. We have everything that we need in our Bibles that we have at home today, in our tablets and on our phone. I mean, we have God's Word. We can go to it and read it every day. By the way, if you're not, I want you to read 16 chapters every day this week. Because my wife's been reading 16 chapters a day. She's talking about it. That's a challenge. If you read about average 15, 16 chapters a day, you'll read through the whole Bible in about 90 days. That's pretty ambitious. I've done it several times, but okay, you know I'm telling a fib. Dick? Right. Yeah. 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 Why is that going to change? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, our disobedience sometimes brings fairly quick consequences, but in some cases may not bring consequences until it's too late, right? Yeah, I think that's, Dick was saying it goes all the way back to the garden, obviously, where that was a very simple, the stipulations there you could fit on one page, right? Do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Was pretty short list of stipulations. But again, the consequences were immediate and they were real. So now you know that you stopped teaching last quarter, right? Okay. Yeah. Too bad. Yep. Yeah. As a reminder. Yeah. I never thought about that way. But that's, yeah. How many years after that do they, a reminder? Yeah. Several hundred. What is that? What is that? Well, let me tell you a story. Okay, well, in the little time we have left, I'll probably go into this more next week. Be thinking about the 10 Commandments. We're going to talk about that as a framework. We've talked about these 4 major blocks now, the historical prologue, the stipulations, etc. The stipulations in Deuteronomy are the most of the book. As we said, it's about 22 chapters of the book, or about 75%. So what we want to try to do next is provide a framework that can serve as an organizing principle to bring some structure to that section. And I find this interesting. I hope you do too, because I hadn't really looked at the 10 Commandments this way, as well as how the rest of Deuteronomy in this middle section is structured around that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is chapter 5, and this is one of the most important chapters in the entire book because it does contain the 10 Commandments. It repeats the 10 Commandments. And I'm going to go through this before we get to next week, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But the phrase, quote, 10 Commandments does not actually appear anywhere in the Bible. You know that? It's kind of back to what Chris's point about there's a different word for command or commandment. Mitzvah is the Hebrew word. It's a different word for command or commandment. The word that's used here in the context of these 10 Commandments, when it uses, quote, 10 Commandments, is a different word. And that word is, I don't know how to say it as much as mitzvah, but debarim, I don't know how to pronounce Hebrew. But anyway, they're called the 10 Devarim, not mitzvah, but Devarim, which is technically words. It's translated a word or a conversation or a phrase. This can be a single word, but here it is more like when we say, can I have a word with you? So if I come and say, hey, can I have a word with you? And you say, sure. And so we leave, wherever we're at, and we walk over to the other side of the room, and I say, blue. Is that, when I have a word with you, it's going to be a little more than one word, right? It's a conversation. Can I have a word with you? So referring to a whole conversation or a topic, not just necessarily one word. For example, so we're gonna talk a little bit more about this next week because I don't have time to continue to go into it. But think about it that way. You might be looking at the chapter 5, just that chapter, because we're going to talk about how that chapter kind of helps us create a table of contents, if you will, for the rest of the book. And we'll go into that more next week. So as long as anybody has any thoughts or questions, then we're going to be done 2 minutes early. Yeah, why don't you come up? Dick would like to come up and say a couple more things. I find it very encouraging, and I hope that you guys know that too. I mean, the more you guys get brave and ask questions and don't ask too many questions, make comments, then the easier it is on me. It makes me feel less nervous. So have a blessed week and have a wonderful evening.